Imagine waking up right now, but not in your room. Not in your time. You open your eyes and you are standing on a flat stone at the edge of a river that exists on no map ever drawn. The water is dark and warm. The smell hits you first, sulfur mixed with wet earth and something else, something you cannot name. Something animal. Something enormous. Something alive. And then you look up. And you see a hand. A single hand, submerged to the wrist in that ancient river. Each finger the size of an old-growth tree. Each knuckle a boulder worn smooth by centuries. The being that owns that hand does not see you. You are too small to be noticed. You are, to that creature, what an ant is to you, a thing below the threshold of awareness. You realize, in that single suspended moment, that you have just witnessed something that every culture on earth has tried to remember and failed to fully describe. You are watching a Nephilim perform the most intimate, the most unexpected, the most human act imaginable. You are watching one of the giants of the antediluvian world wash his hands. This is not a story about war. This is not a story about the destruction of ancient civilizations, though destruction will come. This is a story about something quieter and in many ways more unsettling, the daily life of beings who should not have existed, in a world that no longer does. The Book of Enoch, one of the most ancient and controversial texts ever to survive the erosion of time, describes a world 4,500 years before the Great Flood, a world already ancient by any measure, where the boundaries between the divine and the mortal had been broken. Where the Watchers, the Nephilim, the fallen angels and their hybrid offspring walked alongside the earliest human civilizations, shaping them, corrupting them, and in many traditions, teaching them. And what they taught, according to these ancient writings, was not only war and sorcery. They taught the arts of civilization itself. To understand how the Nephilim practiced hygiene, how giants in the antediluvian world maintained their bodies, their rituals, their relationship with water and with cleanliness, we must first understand the world they inhabited. The world before the flood was not the world we know. The Book of Enoch describes it as a realm of impossible fertility, of rivers that ran hot and cold within miles of each other, of forests so dense and ancient that entire ecosystems existed in the canopy above the ground where no light had ever reached. Civilizations grew in this world with a speed that defied any natural explanation, because they were not entirely natural. The Nephilim were not entirely natural. They were the product of a union that the oldest traditions describe as the greatest transgression in the history of creation, the union between the Watchers, divine beings who had descended from the heavens, and the daughters of men. The Watchers, according to the Book of Enoch, numbered 200. They descended upon a mountain called Hermon, a name that in ancient Hebrew carries within it the root of the word for destruction, for the oath, for the binding of things that should never be bound together. They swore an oath to one another. They descended. And from their union with human women came the Nephilim, a word whose meaning has been debated for thousands of years. Some translate it as those who have fallen. Others translate it as those who cause others to fall. Some ancient traditions describe them as the mighty ones, the giants, the terrible ones of the earth. What the Book of Enoch makes clear is that they were enormous. That their bodies were unlike anything that had walked the earth before or since. And that they were, in the most troubling sense, alive. Alive in a way that created specific and extraordinary problems. The Nephilim consumed. This is perhaps the most striking detail in all the accounts that deal with the giants of the antediluvian world, the ancient sources, from the Book of Enoch to the Dead Sea Scrolls to the traditions preserved in the Book of Giants, return again and again to the question of what these beings ate, what they required to sustain their bodies, and how their existence placed an almost unbearable pressure on the world around them. The ancient texts describe Nephilim of extraordinary size. Traditions vary, some speak of beings 30 feet tall, others describe figures that towered over the largest trees in forests that no longer exist. Some traditions preserved in Aramaic fragments describe Nephilim so vast that their passage across a landscape left scars in the earth that ancient peoples would later interpret as valleys, as riverbeds, as the natural geography of a world that was, in fact, the aftermath of giants walking. And a body that size, a body consuming at that scale, moving through that world, living and sweating and breathing in that ancient atmosphere, a body that size produces waste in proportion. It sweats in proportion. It accumulates the residue of a world more dense and more chemically complex than the one we know. Hygiene, for a Nephilim, was not a luxury. It was a necessity of a completely different magnitude than anything human civilization had yet encountered. What did hygiene mean in the antediluvian world? Before the flood, before the catastrophic reset that the traditions of nearly every ancient culture describe, the relationship between living beings and water was entirely different from anything that came after. The ancient texts speak of a world where water itself was charged with qualities we no longer have language to describe. The rivers of the antediluvian world were not merely rivers. They were, in the understanding of the people who lived alongside the Nephilim, pathways between states of being. Water that came from beneath the earth carried the memory of creation. Water that fell from the sky carried the breath of the divine. And water that had been blessed or cursed or shaped by the presence of the watchers carried something else entirely, a quality that the ancient texts call, in various translations, the fire of purification, the burning of the lower waters, the cleansing that undoes what should not have been made. The Nephilim, born from both worlds, born from both the divine fire of the watchers and the earthly substance of human women, were said to have a particular and complex relationship with water. The Book of Giants, a text discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls and believed to be among the oldest extended narratives about the Nephilim, preserves fragments of what appear to be ritual descriptions, accounts of how the great ones of the antediluvian world engaged with water not merely for the physical removal of dirt but for something more profound. Something that the text treats as a kind of ongoing negotiation between their divine inheritance and their earthly existence. The rivers closest to the settlements of the Nephilim, the great cities of the antediluvian world, those colossal urban constructions that the oldest traditions describe as towering structures of black stone and living wood, cities where the architecture itself seemed to breathe, where the walls were built not from quarried blocks but from boulders the size of houses moved by hands too large to comprehend. Those rivers were said to be changed by the proximity of these beings. Ancient traditions preserved in Ethiopian, Aramaic, and early Hebraic sources describe the waters near Nephilim settlements as warm, as luminous in certain seasons, as carrying a particular taste that human witnesses described variously as iron, as lightning, as the air before a storm. Modern readers might interpret these accounts as the contamination of water sources by bodies too large and too chemically foreign to coexist with ordinary aquatic ecosystems. Ancient readers understood them as signs of the presence of the mighty ones, evidence that the boundary between worlds had been permanently disturbed. The Nephilim washed. This seems almost too simple a statement for beings of mythological proportion, but the ancient sources are surprisingly specific about this. The Book of Enoch and the traditions that draw from it describe the Nephilim as beings who understood, at some inherited level, the importance of water as a physical and spiritual medium. Their Watcher fathers had descended from a realm where purification was not a concept but a condition, a continuous state of luminous clarity that was part of what it meant to exist in the divine orders. When the Watchers fell, or descended, depending on which tradition you follow, they did not entirely lose this inheritance. They carried within them a residual impulse toward clarity, toward cleansing, toward the maintenance of a boundary between the pure and the impure that their transgression had permanently compromised but never entirely erased. And they transmitted this impulse to their children. The Nephilim, according to the traditions most carefully preserved in the Enochic literature, developed what can only be described as elaborate ritual washing practices. Not the perfunctory hygiene of a civilization simply trying to manage physical cleanliness, but something more structured, more intentional, more charged with meaning. The giant settlements of the antediluvian world, cities whose names have been lost to every catastrophe that followed the flood, were built, according to these accounts, around water. Not merely near water, as most ancient civilizations built near rivers for practical reasons of supply and transport. Around water. With the water as the structural center, the organizing principle, the axis around which all other construction turned. The ancient texts describe what can only be interpreted as enormous bathing complexes, structures of stone and wood built to a scale that accommodated beings of tremendous size, where the Nephilim would gather not merely to wash but to perform something that fell between hygiene and ceremony. The water was heated. The Book of Giants preserves a fragment that describes fire beneath stone vessels of a size that would have required dozens of human workers simply to lift a single one, vessels filled from the nearest river and brought to temperatures that the text describes as the heat of a living thing. Hot springs were prized above all other water sources in the antediluvian world, and the Nephilim, according to the traditions preserved in several ancient fragmentary texts, were drawn to geothermal sources with an intensity that bordered on reverence. This makes a certain kind of sense when considered through the lens of what the Nephilim physically were. A body that carries within it the residual heat of divine origin, a body that is the product of supernatural fire mixed with earthly clay, would be drawn to the places where the earth itself generates heat from within. Hot springs, volcanic pools, geothermal vents in the floor of ancient seas, the Nephilim, in the traditions that describe their relationship with water, return again and again to sources of heat. The watchers had descended as fire. The flood would come as water. And in between, the children of that impossible union sought out the places where fire and water already met, where the earth itself performed the alchemy that their own bodies embodied. But hygiene among the Nephilim was not only about water. The Book of Enoch preserves a passage, one of the most frequently discussed and least understood in the entire Enochic literature, in which the watcher Azazel is credited with teaching human beings specific arts and sciences. Among these teachings, often overshadowed by the more dramatic gifts of metallurgy and warfare, were the arts of adornment and bodily care. The ancient text lists these together in a way that suggests they were understood as related, as part of a single category of knowledge concerning the management and presentation of the physical body. Azazel taught, according to the Book of Enoch, the use of antimony for the eyes, the use of beautifying pigments, the crafting of ornaments and the decorating of the physical form. These teachings, the Book of Enoch makes clear, were transmitted to human women. But they originated, in the logic of the text, from a knowledge base that the watchers themselves possessed, a divine understanding of how a body in the physical world must be maintained, decorated, and presented. And if the watchers possessed this knowledge and transmitted it to human women, then the Nephilim, the children of those watchers, would have inherited it as a living practice, not merely as transmitted teaching. The Nephilim did not learn bodily care. They were born into a lineage that understood it as a fundamental necessity of existence in the physical world. What this looked like in practice, when the being in question was potentially 30 or 40 or, in the most extreme traditional accounts, far larger, is almost impossible to fully imagine. The ancient texts do not shy away from the physical specificity of Nephilim existence. The fragments preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly in the Book of Giants, describe Nephilim who are disturbingly physical, beings who dream, who fear, who experience the sensations of their enormous bodies with an intensity that their human inheritance amplifies. They sweat under the sun of the antediluvian world, a sun that the oldest traditions describe as closer, warmer, less filtered than the sun we know today. They accumulate the residue of a world more chemically complex than ours, a world where the atmosphere was denser, where the biology of plants and animals produced compounds that no longer exist, where simply moving through the air left traces on the skin that required removal. The oils used by the Nephilim, according to interpretations of the oldest surviving fragments, were not the simple vegetable oils that later civilizations would use for cleansing. The antediluvian world produced botanical substances of extraordinary complexity and potency, plants that no longer exist, that grew in the specific chemical conditions of a pre-flood atmosphere that was, by every measure, more saturated with life than what followed. These substances were used to clean, to protect, to seal the skin of bodies that were constantly under assault from an environment that their divine inheritance made them simultaneously more sensitive to and more resilient against. The Nephilim, the ancient accounts suggest, were not comfortable in their bodies in the way that purely human beings are. Their dual nature created a constant tension between their heavenly inheritance and their earthly substance, a tension that expressed itself, among other ways, in an unusual sensitivity to physical sensation. They felt heat more intensely. They felt cold as a kind of wrongness, an offense against their nature. And they felt the accumulation of physical impurity as something closer to what a human being would describe as a spiritual disturbance than what we would classify as mere physical discomfort. This is, perhaps, the most remarkable aspect of what the Book of Enoch and the related literature suggests about Nephilim hygiene, that for these beings, cleanliness was not separable from a kind of existential state. To be physically impure was to be in a condition that their divine inheritance experienced as a constant, low-level anguish. The Watchers, in the divine orders from which they had descended, existed in a state of continuous luminosity, a condition of perfect clarity in which no impurity could accumulate because the nature of their being continuously prevented it. When they entered the physical world, they lost this automatic clarity. They became subject to accumulation, to residue, to the gradual overlay of the physical world upon their substance. And the Nephilim, inheriting both the divine sensitivity and the physical vulnerability, experienced this accumulation with an intensity that the purely human beings around them could not fully comprehend. This is why the washing rituals described in the oldest Nephilim traditions are not simply pragmatic. They are desperately sincere. They are the attempts of beings caught between two worlds to manage a condition that neither world had prepared them for, to use the tools of the physical world, water and oil and mineral substances, to address a need that was, at its root, supernatural. The communities that lived alongside the Nephilim, human beings who, according to the Book of Enoch, were already in a complex and increasingly dangerous relationship with these beings, observed these rituals and incorporated them into their own practices. The ancient texts suggest that the transmission of knowledge between the Nephilim and human civilization was not unidirectional. Human beings were not merely passive recipients of what the giants chose to teach. They were also observers, interpreters, and adapters of what they saw the Nephilim do. And what they saw the Nephilim do with water, the scale of it, the seriousness of it, the ritual elaboration that surrounded it, became the foundation for the purification traditions that would survive, in fragments and echoes, in the religious practices of virtually every major ancient civilization that came after the flood. The priests of ancient Egypt who bathed before entering the inner sanctuaries of their temples were performing, in a civilization that began centuries after the flood, a ritual whose roots extended back to the antediluvian world. The purification pools of ancient Mesopotamian temples, the structures called the Apsu, the primordial water, the cosmic ocean that the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions placed at the center of their cosmology, these were not inventions of the post-flood world. They were memories of it. They were architectural and ritual attempts to reconstruct, in the diminished world that survived the deluge, the great washing complexes of the antediluvian Nephilim settlements. And here is where the mystery deepens. Why do so many ancient civilizations separated by thousands of miles, by oceans, by mountain ranges, by every possible barrier to cultural transmission, share not merely the concept of ritual purification with water but the specific association between purification and the presence of beings greater than human? In Hindu tradition, the great rivers are said to have originated from divine beings. In Mesopotamian tradition, the first great washing of the world was performed by gods. In the traditions preserved in the oldest layers of the Hebrew scriptures, the concept of purity and impurity is almost obsessively detailed, as if the people who preserved these traditions were attempting to maintain, in the absence of the Nephilim who had embodied it, a practice whose original meaning they could only partially reconstruct. The answer that the Book of Enoch suggests, indirectly, through the accumulation of its details rather than through any single explicit statement, is that these traditions are not independent inventions. They are parallel survivals of a single original practice. They are the echoes, in dozens of different cultural languages, of the same memory, the memory of watching beings of superhuman scale engage with water in a way that made clear to every human observer that cleanliness was not merely a matter of the body. That purification was not merely the removal of physical impurity. That the act of washing was, at its root, a negotiation between the earthly and the divine, an attempt by a being caught between worlds to find, in the physical act of cleaning, something that the purely physical act could never quite deliver. The flood came. The Book of Enoch, and the traditions that follow from it, describes the flood not merely as a natural catastrophe but as a purification on a cosmic scale, the ultimate washing of a world that had become too impure to continue. The Nephilim, who had spent their entire existence attempting to manage their own impurity through ritual and water and the elaborate hygiene practices of the antediluvian world, were swept away by the very element they had used throughout their lives to cleanse themselves. There is something in this that the ancient authors clearly intended as meaningful, something about the relationship between the individual's attempt at purification and the divine judgment that finds that attempt insufficient. But before the flood came, in the long centuries of the antediluvian world, in the era that the Book of Enoch describes and that the Book of Giants preserves in fragments, in the time when the world was still young enough to contain beings whose existence challenged every category that later human thought would try to impose upon it, the Nephilim washed. They gathered at their enormous river complexes and their geothermal pools and their vessels of heated water. They used the botanical substances of a world more biologically complex than the one we know. They performed rituals whose purpose was simultaneously physical and metaphysical. They maintained, with extraordinary seriousness and extraordinary difficulty, the boundary between the impure and the pure in bodies that had been created by a transgression so fundamental that no amount of washing could ever fully address it. And they were, according to every tradition that has preserved their memory, magnificent. Terrible, yes. Dangerous, yes. The cause of suffering on a scale that the ancient texts describe in language that struggles to find adequate metaphors. But also magnificent. The Book of Enoch does not describe the Nephilim as simply evil. It describes them as tragic, as beings whose existence was itself the tragedy, who did not choose their nature, who were born into a condition that made their destruction almost inevitable but whose lives, before that destruction, contained moments of something that the ancient authors could not quite bring themselves to condemn entirely. A Nephilim standing in a river at dawn, in the last centuries before the flood, the water to his knees, the sun of the antediluvian world rising over mountains that no longer exist, the world around him still and ancient and full of a biological complexity we have no instruments to measure, that figure is not merely a monster from the pages of an apocryphal text. It is something closer to a mirror. A mirror held up to the human experience of being caught between what we are and what we came from, between the impurity of the physical world and the unreachable clarity of something we can name but cannot find. The Nephilim washed. They washed every day, with ceremony and with desperation, in a world that was already ending, attempting to clean bodies that carried within them the original transgression, seeking in water the purification that water alone could never provide. And then the flood came. And the water that had been their ritual, their hope, their daily negotiation with the impossible terms of their existence, that water rose until the mountains were gone and the cities of black stone and living wood were gone and the geothermal pools were gone and the rivers that had carried the memory of creation were gone. And the world began again. Without giants. But with the memory of giants encoded in every purification ritual, every sacred pool, every baptism, every ablution, every ceremonial washing that human civilization has performed, in one form or another, from the moment the waters receded to the present day. The question is not whether the Nephilim existed. The question is why we cannot stop remembering them.